What's up, everybody? Welcome to the thought experiment. Again, nothing I say in this video will be too controversial, but all of my views and opinions reflect that of my own. No financial, investment, organizational advice. None of my views reflect any of the organizations or institutions for which I am a part of. And I appreciate you all listening, tuning in. Be sure to check out any other episodes. Be sure to continue to want to innovate. I love this space. I love neurotech. I love all things to do with building the future. So I hope you enjoy the listen. It's a great episode, and make sure to follow, like, anything, tell people about it. What's going on, everybody? This is Patrick Satina, and welcome back to the thought experiment. Today we're going to be doing a deep dive on Paradromics, another brain-computer interface company. This one targeted specifically at bringing speech back to individuals that have lost it. They can come in many forms, being ALS, advanced forms of ALS, locked-in syndrome, and different types of stroke or other debilitating diseases of the brain that cause this disability to speak or verbalize. So imagine it. Imagine you are an individual and you wake up one day and you've lost the ability to communicate verbally with those around you, or even more so, you've lost the ability to move anything, to enact any volitional movement, to enact any sense of interfacing with the world. That is what can happen to patients with advanced forms of ALS deep into their disease, or individuals with locked-in syndrome, in which they have no ability to, with a very limited ability to interface with the world, to interact with the world, to let people around them know that they're there, that they're conscious, that they recognize what's going on, they can hear, they can observe, they can see, but they can't interact at all with their environment. It's a really tough thing. It's a really tough thing to try to put yourselves in the shoes of. It's something that affects a good amount of people. I mean, it's again limited in the scope of it's not millions, but it affects enough people to where we should really try to address the issues associated with it. And historically, some aid has been brought to these individuals, but it's been limited. And a company like Paradromics or a technology like brain-computer interfaces may be the solution to bridge the gap for those patients to interact once again with the world. Let's get back to Paradromics. So typically this type of ailment of either ALS or locked-in syndrome, an ailment in which you lose the motor ability to vocalize the way you can speak. Typically it's treated with drugs or gene therapies to try and manipulate the biological system to regain somebody's functional capacity to do those things. But there are patients in which the disease is too far along, in which some of these genetic treatment mechanisms or drug treatment mechanisms just are no longer effective, or the individual themselves are just resistant to it. But there is benefit because we know that the individuals still have the desire, right? The desire to do these things. And that desire is still able to be seen at the level of the brain. Our brain still has this emergent activity when these individuals that can't interact, they can't interface with the world, they can't perform their desires, but they still hold them inherently in their brain. And so it's important that we recognize this isn't just moving a cursor on a screen. This isn't just, 4 words popping up a minute. This is truly bringing the world back to people who have completely lost it, have completely lost the ability to go and have any semblance of a meaning and a value of themselves because of the struggles that they've been in. This system is going to be different in its implementation, its technology, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute, versus our last week's episode, which was on in-brain neuroelectronics. In-brain, again, just as a reminder, if you haven't listened to that episode, and I'd recommend you do, in-brain is focused on building graphene-based electrodes. Graphene-based electrodes are a more modern, novel, innovative approach to recording and stimulation technology in the brain that requires very precise manufacturing techniques, similarly to all of these, because of how intricate they're designed and how fine-grained and scaled they are in order to interface directly with individual neurons of the brain. But graphene especially, given that it uses the same technology in which chips, these semiconductors are manufactured, and that's a highly controlled and well-regulated manufacturing process. But they're also, the graphene-based set and from in-brain is still, its efficacy is still being determined, its legitimacy is still being determined, and it's not widely clinically accepted yet, which is an important thing to consider when you're a surgeon or when you're a patient looking for a treatment possibility. So what does Paradromics use? Paradromics, a company based now in Austin, Texas. Paradromics uses this historical, clinically proven, tried and true. It exists in the major players of the industry, like we talked about last week. I'm sure Medtronic has some patents on microwire arrays using platinum iridium. BlackRock Neurotechnology is not the other BlackRock, but the BlackRock associated with the University of Utah. They have about 25 plus patents involving microwire electrode arrays. And so what is this microwire electrode array that I'm talking about? The microwire electrode array is a platinum iridium-based electrode array, where each of its electrodes, so each of its contacts, is thinner than a hair, so at about 40 microns. 40 microns in relevance to millimeters, right? So there's 1,000 micron. And so what you're talking about is you're talking about 0.04 millimeters is the tip or the contact for this device. And the system has between 421 to 1,600 plus channels. They can vary the size and the spatial width of this system greatly, and they can also connect it with other synchronous systems to increase channel count even more. And so again, let's put this in perspective. What is the purpose of this microwire array? What is the purpose for the individual for which it's made? Somebody that has lost the ability to communicate, to effectively bring themselves into the world, to interface with the world. What is the point of this microwire array? The point of it is to act on or to listen to the existing desire signals, right? So again, somebody wants to speak, somebody wants to move their arm, somebody wants to move their leg, somebody wants to move any part of their body is what this device focuses on, right? That desired movement. And so where they're going to be placing this array, again, an array means here a grid of electrodes. So you can think of it like this big rectangle, and you've got all of these electrodes coming out of it that are, again, each of those less than 40 microns wide. Less than 40 microns allows you to really target single cell, single neuronal activity by being able to pick up very high frequency activity. And by very high frequency, I mean acting very quickly. So things are happening very fast in time because, again, a neuron spikes at the interval of 1 millisecond is an action potential. And so you need to be able to pick up that meaningful information. So what's the target? Well, again, we want to pick up, we want to listen to desired movement. What better place to do that than in the motor cortex of an individual's brain? And so we're going to go to the ventral precentral gyrus. And so the way you can think about that is it is going to basically be in the middle of your brain, and they will pick a hemisphere. What you should know about this ventral precentral gyrus is that it is a motor area, or the motor area, that is involved in speech motor control. And so what we're looking for, right, is desired language, desired speech. And so we're going to look at the area for speech motor control in order to achieve the listening of the speech area. So they're going to implant this array about 1,500 microns. Again, that's 1.5 millimeters into the cortex. At 1.5 millimeters into the cortex, you're going to be at layer 5 of that cortical motor area. And layer 5 exists these pyramidal cells, these cells that have direct connection down to the spinal column, where they have these long axons. So these pyramidal cells are these very long, very large cell-bodied cells. They are involved in a lot of the motor output, right? And so you would imagine that there's a computational layer on top that does all the decoding, sends its decoded outputs to the output layer, and then the output layer shoots that down. But again, the issue that we're seeing in these individuals is that that output is not going anywhere. But the output desire, right, the activity is still there. And so this device is going to be 7.5 to 10 millimeters in diameter. And due to its structure, it's this honeycomb structure, and you can imagine a honeycomb, right? You have these hexagons. That's how this device is structured. You're going to get this minimal tissue displacement that they claim. Again, all of these devices, you're going to displace tissue. What does tissue displacement mean? Tissue displacement means that you're going to have, when you implant the device, you're going to have cortex or the brain cortex that gets depressed at that point of entry, because again, you're sticking these electrodes into the brain, and so you're going to have a depression in the brain. It will not cause extreme deficits. In the vast majority of cases, there might not be any effect to the individual. Now, there are definitely active questions as to what does the immune response, right? Like, what does the immune response do to the electrode interface? What does the immune response do to the brain itself? We know inflammation is not good for the brain, and it does, right? There's preclinical, and I'm sure clinical evidence of inflammation. I know that there's preclinical evidence of inflammation given chronic implanted arrays. And so this is the thing that as more and more individuals get these implants, as more and more preclinical work is done, as well as clinical work, we're going to get a better idea as to what the actual effect is to the patient of these devices going in. But again, there's long safety and efficacy of other deep brain penetrating or just even shallow brain penetrating arrays that we know don't cause any extreme adverse effects, and that just might have some mild chronic inflammation response. The device records at 32,000 hertz. 32,000 hertz, for perspective, is 32,000 bits or pieces of data a second, not bits. You can think of it as 32,000 pieces of data a second. That's a lot, right? And that definitely encapsulates our single unit spiking events. It's going to encapsulate even longer activity events where you might be picking up populations of neurons increasing in activity or decreasing in activity. On device, you have a high pass filter to gather meaningful information between 18 and 300 hertz. And what does that mean? What is a high pass filter? A high pass filter is basically giving you the information that exists in that 32,000 hertz signal at the scale of 18 to 300 hertz. And so what most likely you'll be picking up there is not temporally specific time of individual neurons firing, but likely more population level fluctuations in activity, where an increase could mean that you have an increase in activity. A decrease means you have a decrease in activity in that area. The information is then received from the microwires, and it's sent to an on-chip multiplexer that has these 32 high-speed analog outputs, and so it's sending out information very fast. It's sending out information that's usable outside of the data collected right at the tip of the interface very quickly. And then that information is passed through wireless telemetry to an internal receiver in the chest of the individual, subcutaneously. What does subcutaneously mean? It means under the skin. So the individual will have under their skin, in their chest, this basically transponder where they will receive the information in the brain through the array, through the chip that exists on the brain, the little computer on the brain, and then they'll send it down here to the transponder in the chest. And that's done frequently with some devices, as it gives you a larger surface area in order to hold or process data, to have compute, while still not having to outsource all of the compute or the data by passing large blocks of data over Bluetooth to an external device. But you can have this closer transmission of information before you compress more data. You make all of it smaller. You just get the meaningful information to then pass out to control whatever device that you want to control. Or in this case, doing speech production. And so the external pieces are chargeable and they connect to the computer, and the computer will then use a machine learning algorithm to decode the intended speech at 200 bits per second. It's the claimed information transfer rate, which is 200 bits per second. That's basically just the amount of information that is able to be processed. So you could think of it just as like the amount of words that will be able to be said in a specific amount of time, or the amount of decodable, valuable information. And so if I have a select amount of features, I can have 200 bits worth of features that I send out to my machine learning decoder, and that's how quickly it can process information. And they prove, again, they are currently in their first phase clinical trial or preclinical trial. They can prove that 200 plus bits per second. That would be 20 to 25 times the current state of the art of competitors. Again, the clinical target are these locked-in patients, and traditionally, the locked-in patients have been able to use eye tracking or this P300 response. This P300 is this kind of alertness response in which previously in the literature, we've been able to see that this P300 response is this kind of startle response where if you look at an object and then different bars and orientations, either horizontal, vertical, or cross horizontal bars, will elicit different startle responses in your brain. And you can use those to decode either bits of text or letters or phrases to which the individual that can then use to communicate. However, that requires what's called foveation, and foveation is basically just focusing. And once you get to a certain point in both ALS and in this locked-in syndrome, you actually will lose the ability to foveate. And since this whole system is predicated on foveation, it means that you will have very noisy decoders. You will not be gathering relevant information, and you likely will have a low success rate in the desired outcome of the device. The person will not be able to effectively communicate to you. But now traditional like eye tracking is typically, or is also typically used, but you can only get about 2 to 7 words per minute with an eye tracker while you're looking at, say, a keyboard and trying to do a eye track where you're looking at the different letters that you want. Once you focus, again, this also requires some sort of foveation or focusing on specific objects, which, if you lack at a certain point in the disease, will make these systems less and less accurate and then less effective. And what we want is consistent and effective solutions for these individuals, and so that they can have high quality interactions during this process of their disease. The gold standard would be to decode at about 150 words per minute. That is how we speak. And if they are able to prove this 200 plus bits per second, that would give them closer to around 30 plus words per minute. 30 plus words per minute is a lot given the current state of the art. And would be a massive advance, not only just in science and in the technology space of neurotech, but just also in the outcome for each patient, right? Because again, remember, this is what we're doing it for. We're not doing it purely for the science sake, purely for the technology sake, though, like me, and I'm sure like many that are working on it, the desire to see the science take off, to explode, to be the moon landing of space travel and exploration, to be the next Mars landing, right? That's there. That's desire is there, but this is also for the outcome of the individual, the patient that it's built for. And now moving into abstracting a little bit into the patent families, the core technology is this interface probe and the packaging that exists, and the packaging is in the software, is in the array fabrication, is in the signal processing that occurs. And then they also have probably patents, or they do have patents for testing and quality control for the biological membrane protection, and their specific electrode array systems. They term this environment or architecture they use as the Argos CMOS microwire direct system. Argos CMOS microwire detect system. Currently, they have a fully integrated patent portfolio, meaning that they have covered basically all of their bases in patents However, like I stated before, BlackRock has about 25 plus of these microwire type patents. Other companies similarly have microwire type patents focusing on this platinum iridium base. And so the patent space here, not like in-brain, which it was in a novel space, very few other companies and even individuals or research labs were focusing on graphene-based tech. And so they didn't have to worry about as much of this freedom to operate procedure, as much of this risk analysis of, is our tech infringing on somebody else? Will somebody else infringe on our patent technology, our intellectual property? So that's definitely something that I'm sure is constantly going on and going through the heads of the people over at Paradromics. It's different, definitely, than say Neuralink and their thread system, in which they have these flexible polyamide, which is this plastic-esque thing. This and then they finish it or embed it with these gold electrodes. And if we want to take a quick dive into why did I mention platinum iridium in the last episode? Why am I mentioning it again here? Platinum iridium is kind of state of the art in the sense of the electrochemical properties are very strong, very well developed in the manufacturing process to interface with the brain. They have large charge store capacity. Platinum iridium is very corrosion resistant, which is good when you're implanting into biological tissue, especially the brain. Has long-term stability in its again, not only safety profile, but also efficacy profile, where you have impedance, and impedance is basically, the impedance is basically going to dictate the quality of your signal that you're receiving from the tissue. You think of it as something impeding your system. And so the impedance is very, very stable. You do not want it fluctuating or changing, because what that's telling you is that your electrode array interface it's moving. There are things happening around it, whether that be immune responses or something else. And so you really want it to be stable, because you know then that at least you're picking up the same quality of signal over time. And when you're picking up the same quality of signal over time, that means you can apply the same filtering process to those signals over time, which is very important when trying to do analysis on that data that you're receiving. And so they have greater than 1,000 days, multi-years, with signal to noise greater than 5. Signal to noise is how much signal are you receiving per noise unit that you get. And so greater than 5 is very strong. It's very quality. Now let's compare that again to what I mentioned before with Neuralink, who have this flexible polyamide threads where they have those gold-tipped electrodes. Again, gold is inferior to platinum iridium or iridium oxide. Threads for Neuralink are very unstable, but Neuralink will say it is a problem at scale. It is a problem without scale. If you implant 1,000 of these threads and you lose 85% of them, which they did on their first patient. So if you have 1,000 threads and you lose 850, you still will have 150 for which you are gaining signal, which is important. It's very important, because then you can still provide structured decoding at that level of information reception. The chronic biocompatibility is unknown because it's not a largely used type of system. And when we get into the Neuralink episode, we're going to talk a little bit about how the benefit of the Neuralink framework, the Neuralink business model, is not actually in the device that they're building, the devices to interface directly with the brain they're building. It's actually in the surgical robot. So it's a little hint at what that episode will mainly look like. There are some benefits, right, as opposed to platinum iridium microwire or microelectrode arrays, is that you have this flexible entry, right? These threads are very highly flexible, and they kind of sprout out after you implant them, so that you have in theory, lower inflammatory response on implanting, but it requires their surgical robot. It requires this lead needle to implant. They need to thread these right into the brain. Okay, so let's get back to our device here, or the device at Paradromics, what our current episode is focused on. The device at Paradromics, filtering happens on device in the CMOS architecture, where you can preserve these high-fidelity signals. Neuralink, as a competitor, does even more processing on their system to limit the data output, right? So you could think of it like this. You want to there's a balance between how much information you can receive and how much information then you have to pass out of the brain to control whatever system you want to control. So again, if I want to do speech decoding and I want to use relevant information to decode what somebody wants to say, if I take all of the information, right, all the 32,000 bits of information per second, and I am constantly recording this information from the individual's brain to have a continuous flow of back and forth with minimal lag, minimal latency. We do not yet have the really packaging system, the compute setup that will make that possible. And so what these companies will do is they will do something is called data compression. And so they'll basically compress the overall size of their data packages that they send out so that they can quickly, with minimal latency or lag, and what I mean by that is from the moment that I have the desire to the moment that the outcome is performed. So the moment I have the desire to say a word, say the word is dog, the lag between me thinking, say dog, and the actual system saying dog or writing out dog is as minimal as possible. So again, there's a balance, right? Because if you leave out too much information, you might minimize the actual accuracy of your system. But if you incorporate too much information, so if you lose too much information, you might not have the meaningful data or features to decode the desired output. If you have too much data, you're going to actually overload your system, and the lag and the latency is going to be too long that it doesn't even make sense for the individual to use a device because it won't effectively communicate. If they have to wait 15 seconds for each word to be decoded, it won't effectively communicate their desires in as close to real time as possible, right? Real time, the way that I'm speaking based off of what I want to say right now, is the most beneficial type system. That is gold standard. That's what we would love to achieve. In practice right now, that is not exactly what we can achieve in the clinic, right? And that's is the purpose of these companies trying to raise more money, to do more R&D, to partner with labs. That's part of the reason of doing this podcast, is to get the word out there for a lot of these things, to have people focus on how important they can be and they should be to provide as big a benefit to these patients and these people as possible. And so Neuralink, getting back to them, is a competitor to Paradromics, not only locally, right, both in Austin now, but also just in the brain-computer interface neuroprosthetic neuroelectronics space. Neuralink does even more processing on system, but this decreases the data for decoded optimization, right? So they compress even more information, but then they have less data. So they're chasing latency, minimize latency, and say, we can do really, if we have a lot of these electrodes, if we have a lot of these threads, and we minimize and compress as much data as possible from each of them, we will still have enough meaningful information, and we will write really good software to decode the information. We don't need as much data as you claim you need. We can do it with less. Paradromics, though, is currently the industry leader, right? If they can hit that 200 bits per second, that's industry leading. And so they're leading the industry, they're leading the field in design and acquisition of these high-dimensional neural data interfaces for decoding. That's a big picture breakdown of Paradromics tech. And again, let's get back to funding, right? Paradromics has funded, again, if I want to compare to Neuralink, significantly less. Now, Neuralink is pretty self-funded and raising, and they have Elon Musk behind it. And so they inherently will raise more money. But it's important for the players of this field to not get discouraged or to not turn their backs on that, right? To turn their backs on, you've got this big personality that got big money. It's easy to say we don't like them. We don't want to mess with them. We don't like the way they do things. What could Paradromics do with the $570 million that Neuralink has? I'm sure they could do a whole lot. There's a whole lot of very talented, very strong people there. And again, the field is gaining popularity. The field is gaining money and funding. And so it's going to be important for these individuals to recognize that money does not only get you clinical access through the FDA to get through the clinical pipeline towards approval, but money also will get you marketing. Money will get you greater R&D, more research, more partnered institutions, more licensed technology, more intellectual property. You can't underestimate, despite the fact that you do not think these other players in the field are experts or know what they're talking about, you can't underestimate what they can do, who they can get with money, with access, and with messaging. And so if the experts, and if you feel like you're an industry leader, you can do that. Money, fundraising, of course, I'm sure is a priority, but messaging and access, knowing people, getting to know many people and trying to learn from them, build from them, and incorporate them into your system is going to be very important. So who is Paradromics? Who are the people behind Paradromics? We talked a lot about their technology. Let's talk a little bit about them. Paradromics is a company that was founded by CEO Matt Engel, who's got his PhD, and he did a postdoc afterwards. And so it's kind of a tale of two tapes is Paradromics. They have Matt Engel, their CEO, their CMO, chief medical officer, and their CSO, their chief science officer, that have PhDs, postdoc experience, academia experience. They've been doing research for a long time. They know the science, they know the research, they know the field. And then on the flip side, their operating officer and vice president of finance are the ones that come in with this previous actual biotech industry experience where they worked at a spinal cord company. So they know the FDA regulatory process. They know what it takes to get through it. They know what it takes to run an FDA-regulated biotechnology company, especially one that interfaces directly with the nervous system. They know how to work with the surgeons, to work with the individuals that will implant their devices. And so to me, it's a very strong leadership team. It's a leadership team that's diverse in its relevance, right? You do not want to hire multiple of the same people that can do the same thing. You want to hire people that have individual skill sets that will complement each other, that will bring each other up, right? That are not redundant on each other, that will challenge each other, is important as well. And I think that this team that they have at Paradromics is strong, at least in the background of the individuals. The individuals themselves have raised about $125 million to date. They had a massive Series A funding round at $95 million. And I'll walk through a little bit of their funding history to give you kind of a glance as to what does that look like, right? So they were founded, I believe, in 2017 or 2015, 2017, somewhere around then. And their first seed funding round was in June of 2018, where they raised $7 million. That was number one. That was process number one. Then in 2021, they raised $20 million. 2022, $7.5 million. 2023, $33 million. 2023 again, $17 million. And then 2025, across two funding rounds, they raised $95.5 million to bring the total again to $125 million. And I bring this up because as they continue to grow, as they continue to expand, not only will they require more money for the cost of employees, of growing just a company growing, but in this world, in the biotech world, you also have the exorbitant cost of FDA approval, the FDA approval pipeline, and so funding is a very, very important thing. Similar to how funding for nonprofits is a very important thing. In a way, startups act as nonprofits. The health of a startup is not in how much revenue necessarily they are bringing in, but how much reinvestment they are doing, how much money they are raising to spend. So a deeper dive at the costs at Paradromics before we get into more of the industry, more of what is their look in the industry like? Where do they play a role? They have about 100 employees. Again, clinical trials for class 3 medical devices, which what they would be labeled as, is about $30 to $50 million to then reach in-human, right? For that first level, right? Which is like 3 to 5 patients proving safety, which they're about to start. They might have just started. And this FDA pipeline through and through could cost between 100, 150, $200 million. What does that get you? That gets you, again, this initial FDA safety screening, basically, where you get the thumbs up after a long, rigorous process of getting the approval to do so, the pre-approval to do so, to do around 5 patients, prove your device is safe. Then you can move on to doing more like 15 patients to prove that what you're actually doing is effective and will bring a meaningful solution to individuals. And afterwards, then that's where you get into the large-scale clinical trial, which is multi-institution across the country, which you need to prove that your device not only is safe and effective where you are at your institution, but also across institutions. So again, let's assume that most recent $95 million, let's assume that's current operating budget after they received it. given the type of equipment, given the regulatory structure that they are facing, given R&D expenses, the number of employees they have, and the fact that they currently have active clinical trials, it is likely that they have around $3 to $5 million of burn a month. Again, take that at the high end. If you have $5 million of burn a month, that gives you, I would say, what does that give you? 5 times 18. So it gives you 19 months, right? Now, if we go to the low end, that gives you closer to 32 months of spend, right? And so these are the timetables that companies like this, startups, act on. How much money do we have? How much burn do we have? How many months can we stay relevant, stay alive, stay afloat to prove that what we're doing is meaningful and relevant? That's why funding in these cases is major, major player. And I expect that they will go back to funding either late 2026 or early 2027 when their burn gets closer to being a year and a half less than to a year, right? A year to year and a half left of burn, especially in the clinical trial environment that they're in now, which is going to raise burn costs. I expect late 2026, early 2027. Looking at some of the key investors, I don't really know any of these names, but Neom Investment Fund, Prime Movers Lab, Dolby Fan Ventures, Green Sands Equity. Maybe one day I'll do a deep dive on the different types of private equity companies, not even private equity, the different types of venture capital firms that provide equity, provide capital to these startups, especially in this biotech, neurotech space. Clinical safety, they are currently acting on 3+ years of biocompatibility in sheep with accurate and stable recordings. And again, right now, they are in the process of starting and showing safety in a preclinical approved population of patients where they are implanting their device and saying after a specified amount of time that we have no adverse effects, hopefully, knock on wood. And then, they'll most likely be collecting some data during that time, but the data that they collect doesn't even matter for the FDA. It's the next step that matters for the FDA for showing efficacy, right? First is safety, then is efficacy, then is safety and efficacy broadly applied. Let's now dive a little bit into where they exist in the field as a whole, where they, again, are focused in on this locked-in syndrome. They're focused in on ALS, advanced ALS patients. And so let's take locked-in. Let's take the locked-in syndrome, which, let me get the word for it here. It's otherwise known as anarthria. And locked-in syndrome, again, just to explain it a little bit more, to give some credit, I can't give full credit to the people that suffer from this disease. Very debilitating, very sad. They basically are completely unable to have any desired output occur. They can't move their arms, they can't speak, they can't, I believe they feel based off of clinical evidence, at least for the most part. And for a while, this is what was looked at as like the vegetative state, right? And again, that's not the proper way to say it, or to put it, but it was when people thought you lost consciousness. Something was there, but it was not you anymore. But recently, given the advancements in technology like this, in eye tracking, we can actually now know that these individuals were always there. They were conscious. They were in there. They just couldn't interface directly with the world. And so locked-in syndrome patients, they still can live under medical treatment, under help, under aid, under constant help. They can live 10+ years after being diagnosed. It's about at 78%. Rate. ALS, on the other hand, advanced ALS, larger patient population. Again, locked-in syndrome is this anarthria is ALS is a larger patient population at about 33,000 in the U.S. It's expected to grow to around 36,500 by 2034, about 10% population increase in this advanced ALS. Why is that? Just growing population, changing population demographics, getting older, population demographics getting older. 70% of the 33,000 patients will accrue or develop some dysarthria during the disease, which is, again, this inability to voluntarily speak. Stroke and spinal cord have smaller patient populations that are affected with this, but it still happens, right? It still happens at, especially for stroke, a good amount of individuals can develop some type of weakness in their ability to speak and their ability to have desired output, desired vocalization. Currently, Paradromics, I believe, just got a breakthrough device Clearance, let me check that. Yep, breakthrough device clearance. That means that they are able to expedite the development and patient access to their innovative medical devices. And I believe they will receive some reimbursement for Medicaid and Medicare costs for individuals and patients. And so more people will have access to getting the device, and that, they don't have to just rely on people that can come out of pocket. Insurance companies won't bill this device because they won't have a billing code for it, because they haven't proven that it's safe, it's effective, or that it will lower costs to insurance companies. And so again, let's look at ALS. Greater patient population, about 70% developing dysarthria. So the first year of ALS Medicare is typically $47,500. That's 3 times the typical cost. Lifetime, it could cost about $1.4 to $1.5 million if you have yearly home care, which can cost around $200,000 a year. Locked-in syndrome, you would get even more. The total addressable market, again, let's say, is 31 to 37,000 patients. I hate to treat patients as a market, but in this case, the patients represent the size of the addressable population for this device. And all in all, we're going to say that the Paradromics system is about $125,000. Again, Paradromics previously estimated their system would cost about $100,000, but I would assume by the time that they're able to actually get it to market full scale, it'll probably be closer to that 125,000 mark. And so let's take 35,000 patients for an example. If everybody, assuming that 35,000 is the total market of patients that develop dysarthria from ALS, you would be looking at approximately $4.4 billion market size, with maintenance and software upkeep yearly at about $15,000 a year, costing about $525 million a year of the yearly market size, overall market size being approximately $4.4 billion, if everybody got it. Now let's just say the US is 25% of the world market. Overall market in the world would be between 13 and 22 billion. Keep 1.6 to 2.6 billion a year. Decent size, but compared to any commodities market, any energy sector, very small. But addressing specific needs of most left out, damaged, unable to interface individuals of society, which brings significant benefit. Because if you can lower the burden of care on these individuals by providing them with some relief, right? Again, I said $200,000 a year to somebody with advanced ALS that has this dysarthria that isn't able to communicate. If you can lower that cost from $200,000, even $50,000, $60,000, $40,000, it likely puts less of a stress on the individuals supporting them and opens up more opportunity for those individuals to spend that money elsewhere, to live a more independent lifestyle, to give more meaning to the patient and more freedom to the caregivers, to the family, than what is currently available. Now, if they want to do any type of expansion, which they've discussed and is now a growing topic, is the use of these types of devices, implantable devices for mental illness, advanced mental illness, that is a definite increase in the addressable market, the addressable area for which these devices could be used. Let's take severe depression as an example, a very serious issue, a very serious illness that is not to be taken lightly. They could expand the patient population to be treated greatly. There's approximately 15 million Americans with severe depression, between 100 and 200 million worldwide, unknown. A lot of places this isn't tracked, this isn't kept in check or known. So if you take the entire market, the entire patient population for severe depression, you would be looking at almost $2 trillion worth of treatable or treatments, and about 225 billion a year, and nearing $10 trillion plus worldwide. This is very unrealistic. And again, it's treating it as a side-off commodity, but it's not. This is the cost of treating very debilitating, interfering, life-altering, life-changing diseases for not only specific individuals, but their support systems as well. So let's consider major depressive disorder, about 2.8 million in the US. That would be about $350 billion worth of medical costs. And it's important to think about a lot of these things in the lens of, yes, it's a market and it's a cost that's large. 350 billion is a lot of money. But the question is, how does that compare to the cost of the individual for continued medical treatment, of therapy, of drugs, of pharmaceuticals, the lack of opportunity for income, the cost to family members for all the above treatment mechanisms, the loss of work hours for them. That is the unsung costs of a lot of these things. That when you bring devices to market that give individuals an ability to re-interface with the world somewhat, to bring themselves back into society, to help us bring them back into society, it lessens the burden on a lot of things around them, which is an important thing to discuss in this lens. Forbes recently talked about mental illness BCI market being at least as high as $240 billion. I think it would be higher. With growth occurring in the BCI industry between 2024 to 2025 or 2035 is expected to have about 15 to 16% raise in market size from 1.6 to 2.4 to 10 to 12 billion dollars. Again, if there's any sort of addressable market adopted for BCI use for mental illness, that market size is going to explode. The cap of that market is going to blow up, and Medicare reimbursements seem to be actually helping. So I talked again previously about the breakthrough device authorization and giving some type of Medicaid, Medicare reimbursement package. It's very much so helping in the access of these devices, of these breakthrough, innovative, helpful devices across broad patient populations, not just wealthy individuals that can buy it, can get access, but more Americans can get access, which gives not only greater opportunity for treatment, but also greater patient population demographics to check how this device works across patient populations. And the reimbursements to light is important because it's giving the market more traction, the BCI market, the implantables market more traction to then be more broadly applied across the board in the United States. And so I estimate that if you have in this patient population again, we're going to go back to the ALS patient population, and you have 7 to 10,000 patients at $125,000. Never mind. We're gonna go look at the patient population for major depressive disorder, in which the individuals are at the highest end of the clinically depressed group. We're gonna assume 10% of the patient population. At about 7 to 10,000 patients and $125,000 cost of this device. It's about a $1 billion market size. And assuming after 3 years, or 3 to 5 years, that you have that 10 to 15% installed, you have 15 to 20,000 patients with a $15,000 continual annual upkeep, you'll be at about 225 to 300 million, with a total annual revenue peak between 665 and 925 million after the Medicaid reimbursement. You have to put up 20% of costs. Again, let's look at this from a broader lens. Paradromics has the opportunity to definitely infiltrate not only the target market right now, which is the most affected individuals that require speech therapy, right? The depression and the mental health would come in the frame of a different lens, where they would be using the device for something entirely different, which is the flexibility of these systems, right? But right now, this system is being optimized for the speech decoding, right? Bringing people with ALS, bringing people with advanced ALS, this anarthria, the locked-in syndrome, bringing them back more into society, more into interfacing with their environment by allowing them to speak, to communicate, to have conversations again. And I definitely think that there's an opportunity for Paradromics to be a loud, large, strong mover in the market if they can continue through this FDA process with continuing to raise money, continuing to show safety, and eventually showing safety and efficacy across a broad patient population, while also communicating, interfacing with surgeons, to which they can build relationships so that surgeons are willing to implant, know how to implant, and their system can become more broadly applicable. They do have some risks. The systems themselves, despite having a very long track record for the platinum iridium-based systems, could have signal instability, could have some unknown issues that have not come up yet, that the preclinical, early clinical safety data might show. And of course, there's some competitors out there in the space. There's people that are trying things through a different lens. And so that that type of technology could take the foothold as the strong man of the industry in how these devices are built, whether it's through this microwire array structure, or whether it's going to end up being through the graphene-based structures or silicon or some type of other man-made electrical interface, or as is being popularized now, these ultrasound technologies and gene therapy technologies. So the field is advancing. It is very interesting. Paradromics is definitely a leader. They're definitely out there trying to get their message across. I think they could do more. And I think the BCI neurotech space will continue to grow in popularity. I think AI, this whole neural network stuff, the keywords get mixed together sometimes, and people will read things that are interesting and that revolve around the BCI space. And so I'm excited to see where Paradromics continues to go. They're one of my favorite companies in the space, and I love them being in Austin. I think there's a lot of benefits there. So I'm excited. That wraps up basically today's episode. I appreciate everybody listening. Again, my opinions on these matters, my thoughts on these matters, my research on these matters reflect all of my own beliefs and opinions, none of the institutions, organizations for which I'm a part of. I do not say anything too controversial, but in case anybody does find them controversial, it is me. It is nothing that I am a part of. And again, this is my passion. This is the stuff I love. I want to bring more of this information to market, more of this information to more people, because I believe in the future of the world. I believe in a future of flying cars, of colonizing space, of communicating without phones, purely based off of thought, with interacting with the world in a more biotech-oriented system, to seamless drug delivery, to all the things that I think will make the world a significantly better place for a significantly more amount of people. I'm an innovator. I am an entrepreneur at heart, and I will continue to be, and I appreciate you listening. I will be back with more information and episodes in the coming weeks. So thanks again, and have a great day.